want to welcome you to the third program of our 31st year of the Dr. Harold C. Deutsch World War II History Roundtable. I just came back from New Mexico, and many of you have seen this statue before. It's the POW MIA. It's in the Veterans Park in Las Cruces, New Mexico. And as you'll find out this evening, many of the POWs in the Bataan Death March were from the 200th Coast Artillery in the New Mexico National Guard. This is a wonderful statue and a moving area. The detail on it is unbelievable. The web gear almost feels like it's fabric. The significance, there's always symbolism in it. If you look at one of the fellows, he's looking forward. If you look at this fellow, he's looking down. And the fellow here is looking back. I just spoke to this gentleman that's standing by the memorial, Jerry Schertz. And I want to explain his championing of that. If you notice in the imprints here, Jerry went all over the country. Of course, a lot of them are from the New Mexico area. He got the footprints of the guys that were in the Bataan Death March. When you look at this one, Walter Straka is 29, and Henry Peck was also one of the 194th. Here's where the monument is, and again, you see the chart and the symbolism going through here. Las Cruces is maybe a long way from Minnesota, but this is, if you're in that area, please go see this memorial. And with that, that's our lead-in. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't. And here is Walter Straka's footprints and packs that were done here in Minnesota, taken there, and put in the wet concrete. But I'm sure that Paul had terrible stories to talk about as a prisoner of the Germans. You were a prisoner for 5 months, 5 months, and I don't want to minimize that, because I heard that many times from John Klein, the horrible things that you guys went through. But you got to remember these people that we're talking about in the program this evening. They were captured in the early spring of '42, and they were prisoners of war under terrible treatment until August of '45. And that's what the story is about this evening. Our speaker this evening is Steve Moore. Steve, I don't think he sleeps. He's written 18 books. He got started, and I know you folks will tease me. He didn't go to Texas A&M, so it's you'll forgive him for that. But Steve started writing about his family in the early parts of the Texas settlement, rebellion, and subsequent development of Texas into the statehood. And then he started doing some World War II naval aviation histories. One of his books on Texas was actually a TV documentary called Texas Rising. You may have seen it several years ago. But he's spent most of his effort in the Pacific on aviation, and then the departure we have this evening on the events at Palawan. This is his second time here. He did a wonderful program year and a half, 2 years, 3 years ago. They go by so fast, don't they, folks? On the Pacific payback and the aviation at Guadalcanal. And welcome again to Minnesota. I'm sorry that we're having a little bit of weather that maybe is a little bit adverse. But Steve Moore, tell us about Palawan.
This is a story I kind of found out about doing some other research. 11 guys that escaped a POW camp that were not supposed to escape. And I'll start a little bit, kind of give you a little backstory. I've done a few books on World War II submarines. And one of them I did was called Presumed Lost. Came out a number of years ago by the Naval Institute Press. And it's about the final patrol of 7 U.S. submarines in World War II. 525 collective guys going out on those boats. And for various reasons, they don't come back. And when a boat does not return, it's listed as overdue and presumed lost if they don't know what's happened to it. Well, in these cases, some of the men, in one case there was only one survivor, a guy from Texas. Other cases, a couple of the boats, the entire crew was captured when, say, they were so badly depth charged they had to scuttle the boat and take to the water. But I go through the story of what happens to those guys and what they endure in the various POW camps in Japan and in different places out in the Pacific. At the end of the war, only 158 of them would be alive out of the 196 that were picked up originally. The bottom corner down there is some of the Grenadier men. They were picked up in 42, so they did a lot of time. And the picture on the right you've seen quite a bit published with the handmade Allied flags and American flag that the guys made in the Amori camp. They were the first to be liberated. Harold Stassen, the Minnesota governor, was part of the staff there that helped come in and liberate the guys there from the very first camp. So a lot of stories there, but along the way, one of the boats, the USS Robelo, went down, hit a mine off Palawan, or Palawan as they say it in the Philippines. Some of the men, found out later there were 10 of them, took to the water. Some of them made it to one of the islands, and eventually, long story short, 4 of them would be herded over to a POW camp in a place called Puerto Princesa on Palawan Island. They'd be interrogated and then eventually disappear off the books, and various stories that maybe they died in the massacre there. They went back to Manila and they were executed. But I wrote what I could at that time. But a little bit later, I came to decide there's quite a story there about this massacre that took place. So I want to spend a little time today and tell you about that and what happened. The result of that is this book called As Good as Dead. And it's the Palawan POW Camp 10A near a little city called Puerto Princesa. Say little city, it was actually the second largest city at that time on the island. It was one of the larger of the 7,000 islands that make up the Philippine chain out there. More than 600, give or take a little bit more than 600 men were processed through this camp or spent time there at one time or another, starting with August 1st, 1942. And I looked back and did a few notes for Don. I can find at least 10 men, probably more than that were from Minnesota, that were brought in with that first bunch of 346 men that went to Palawan on the work detail. 9 of them, for various reasons, would eventually get transferred back to Manila, back to other camps. I'll talk a little bit more about some of those circumstances. The 10th guy from Minnesota, John Lyons, did not survive, and we'll try to come back and touch on that in a little bit. But they were basically put to work, slave labor type work. But how did they get there? Let's back up a little bit. Pearl Harbor, the attack on the Philippines, and what goes on for the next few months up until April 9th, when those still holding out on the peninsula there in Bataan are finally forced to surrender. You've got thousands of men, Americans and Filipinos, who are forced to endure what's called the Death March, distances varying from 50 to 65 miles over numerous days. During the course of that, thousands of men would die. some say 8,000, 9,000, up to 10,000 American and Filipinos would die or be murdered. All kinds of horrible things happened along that trek. You've heard about that, but some of the guys that would go to Palawan were part of this march. One of the guys that opted not to take part in the march was Alberto Pacheco. He's a corporal with the 200th Coastal Artillery Group out of New Mexico. Big group from New Mexico that trained in El Paso and in New Mexico that went over to the Philippines. He fought there up until April 9th, and then the orders come that we're going to surrender and you guys have to do what you got to do. Some of them, hundreds of people actually decided they're not going to surrender. They're going to go across the bay to Corregidor Island. Pacheco and another guy actually took to the water to swim. And weak condition, poor food, poor conditions for months on end, but he's so determined not to be a prisoner, he's going to swim across the bay, miles across, and fight to the end. Luckily, he was picked up by one of the whale boats that's ferrying some of the people over to Corregidor, and he didn't have to make the whole swim. So Pacheco joins the group, and not to give too much away, but he will be one of the 11 survivors we'll talk about later. He joins the fight there on Corregidor, which of course was known as the Rock, the fortress out there. There are several other military bases on some of the little small islands in Manila Bay. But of course, I won't go into the whole story of what happens there, but we know that MacArthur's ordered out. He opts to take the escape route and flee to Australia, leaving General Skinny Wainwright in command. The men do fight and hold back, but they're pounded by artillery for weeks on end until finally May 6th, the time comes that the orders are passed, we're going to have to surrender. And so you've got somewhere in the neighborhood of 16,000 American Filipino troops on Corregidor and some of the other little island bases that surrendered to the Japanese. So here's a map, kind of give you an idea of the bay there, where Corregidor was, and some of the other little islands are kind of too small to see there. Those that take up the death march are eventually moved to rail cars and herded up to other camps, such as Bilibid Prison, Cabanatuan, Camp O'Donnell, and other places along the way. The treatment is horrible. They're packed into rail cars like cattle. A car that should hold 40 or 50 people is packed with more than 100. Some of the people perish because of the heat and everything just in the cattle cars, moving them from one place to another. The rest that are still holed up on Corregidor, they're forced to surrender, and they spend their first days on an old seaplane ramp right by the edge of the water, and broiling sun, no food, no water, thousands of men, and they have one little water spigot to drink from that they can line up, and by the time you get a drink of water and wait 6 or 8 hours to get another drink, you're pretty much standing in line perpetually. The Japanese do move them eventually out to the bay onto some merchant ships, take them across the harbor, move them to Manila, and they're moved up into some of these other camps. And the guys spend a number of months there, seeing people executed. They're on torture, work details that are just horrendous. And some of them eventually hear of different opportunities to go other places. One in July is an unknown work detail, but some of the guys decide, I don't care what it is or where they're going, it's got to be better than the hell we're going through here. So they volunteer for it, and they're moved down to the bay and put onto ships. And 346 men would be picked, officers and men, taken to another Philippine island called Palawan on a hell ship called the Sanko Maru. They're treated fairly civil on the ship as opposed to what others would go through later as far as POWs being transported on ships. They reached Palawan Island on August 1st, 1942. Again, at least 10 Minnesotans were part of that initial group that come in there. And during the course of this couple of year period of time, people will get sick, they'll get hurt, they'll be shipped back to Manila, to Cabanatuan and other camps like that, and they'll bring in more able-bodied men, a dozen, 20, 30 at a time. I kind of track the different groups that come and go there. But this is the scene as they first walk in. It's an old Filipino barracks there that's run down and abandoned, but it's got these giant stone pillar arches as you come in. And so the guys are marched in, 1st of August there. Some of the other buildings are used by the Japanese guards, and there's a couple of barrack buildings in there. They're in poor shape. So they spend their first days trying to clean up and make the barracks somewhat livable. And the little dirt road you see there is going to run them out to the jungle to some of the work projects they're going to start working on. They're told they're going to start clearing roads through the jungle for the Japanese and for the people of Palawan. And I think, well, okay, doesn't sound so bad. They're promised better food and better treatment. But pretty quickly they can tell it's not going to be better. And immediately some of the guys are thinking about escape. This is an aerial view of the camp that's taken later in the war. And the kind of square building there is some of the main barracks. And it's a bad picture, it's hard to see because it's taken from high altitude, but up to the right is one of the Japanese barracks. To the left, hard to see, that's going to be where some of the trenches are. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. And the water's directly below, and you can see there's almost no beach, so it's pretty much a sheer drop from the top of that bluff down to the beach. Here's a view of the island to give you a perspective of how long it is. It's long and narrow. And a couple of key points are pointed out, such as at the bottom, the row below where she was lost. This is in 44. But it's beautiful there. I mean, at their first sight, the POWs think this is not so bad. So there's the island. We won't come back to the map so much later, so I'll point out a couple of things. Later in 44, there's some Allied coast watchers landed in a couple of positions on the island, one a little more northern, one a little more southern. And as the war goes on, there's a lot of Filipino guerrillas and people like coast watchers working out there to report on Japanese troop movements, shipping movements, conditions of POWs. And so these guys are kind of rebels out there, little small groups with radios, and they'll come into play later. But you know, at first sight, they see the beautiful turquoise waters, beautiful beaches. It looks pristine, but things are not so well there, and it's just a short matter of time before guys start talking about escaping. Well, one of them here is a Navy yeoman named Bruce Elliott, and he'd thought about escaping before, but 10 days in, he talks a group in that says, hey, we're going to get over the walls and get out of this place. Now, granted, you're on the island you just saw, which has Filipino folks on there. The rest is all Japanese. There's no allies to be found, and you're in the middle of the Pacific out there in the Philippines, so you have to kind of wonder what they're thinking, but they're determined we're not going to stay in this camp any longer. So 3 Marines and 3 sailors go over the wall, head down to the beach in the cover of darkness, and run along the beach for about a mile, find an old banca, a native sailing canoe type vessel, sail down the coast, hide during the daytime, and keep sailing and keep working their way south to another little settlement down there. And they eventually fall into the hands of some of the local Filipinos who are there to help them. A guerrilla network we'll talk more about in a minute. But Elliott's group disappears, they're not seen, and so it kind of creates a will that, hey, maybe there's a way out of here. The people still in the camp, the other 300-odd Americans, are forced to stand at attention for days and have their rations cut. The commandant is embarrassed and upset. He doesn't torture them so bad. He was the most lenient of the camp commandants they would have, the first one they endured in 1942. So here's another guy from Bruce Elliott's escape group. I found this fascinating to find these guys and find their escape and evasion reports and what they did and what went on. And in some cases, they're on the run for more than 2 years, sailing between different islands, or in some cases picked up from Palawan. Elliott would be picked up by an American submarine after he'd sailed to another Philippine island, March 2nd, 1944. Fellow here is a Marine corporal named Sidney Wright. He had the chance to be rescued at the same time some others did, but he opted to keep working with one of the colonels there that was running the Guerrilla Network, and he took a commission, jumped over to the Army and became a second lieutenant, and he stayed in the fight through the end of the war. He was a Texan. He retired back there and had a family after the war, but he opted to not be rescued after being on the run all that time. 3 more escapes from the Palawan camp would happen over the next year or 2. One was just a couple of weeks after the first group got out. In this case, 2 Navy guys made an escape into the jungle. They learned when the Japanese would take roll. They'd do a head count in the morning when they got to the work camp, to the work area, and then at the end of the day, they'd take one before they were herded on the trucks and taken back to camp. And so they learned right after the noon mess, they'd get a little rice ball, a little bit of food, do a count. Shortly thereafter, we can disappear, and we've got till the end of the day before we're counted again. They make it on the run, and you can read about that in the book if you choose, but one of them, Charlie Watkins, is seen there on the lower side there on the submarine Redfin, 2 years later, finally being rescued and picked up. February 2nd, 43, 4 more escapees By this point, a second commander has taken over the camp. After the first two escape groups, it's not recorded, but I have to imagine there was some embarrassment, there was some shame on him, and probably he didn't go to a very good assignment after that, after having two groups of POWs escape. The next group, two of them are recaptured. They're tortured pretty severely and sent back to Manila. One of them died during his time on the run. But the fourth guy, Bill Swift, stayed on the run, and he's picked up in 1944. About 6 months or 3 or 4 months later, there's two more escapees, and by this point, there's no leniency to it. When these guys are recaptured days later, they're brought back to the camp, tortured by the Kempi military police, tied to palm trees, stabbed, bayoneted, brought back out and tortured for days on end, and then they're finally taken out and executed. So those that are left are put into groups of 10. If one of your guys escapes, they're told, doesn't matter, the rest of you 9, we're going to kill all you guys. So if you escape, you better go all 10 of you, because we're going to kill the rest of them. The road they were working on turned out not to be a road after all. They pretty quickly realized they were working on an airstrip, a major airfield for the Japanese. And this is what it starts looking like on Palawan after these guys have been doing hand labor for months. Pickaxes, shovels, bare tilt machetes, and they're chopping down trees, pulling up root balls, crushing coral, trying to get this ready to be paved. And it's not until later on in 43, 44 when they bring in a couple of cement mixers and they can start putting down concrete and pouring the runways. But the first year is pretty much all slave labor, hand labor, the worst of conditions. If you get hurt on the job, you just go back and you work. If you go back to camp, you get your rations cut. So not much choice but to keep on working. Now in camp, the guys did what they could for entertainment, which was not much, but they'd go into some of the old buildings when the guards weren't looking and steal anything they could. A guy on the right there, Mac McDowell, he and a couple of his buddies made a set of playing cards out of pieces of cardboard and some colored pens he found, and he meticulously drew the whole deck, all the cards, all 52, colored them in. And that was their thing, playing poker, trading cigarettes or rations, gambling that way. You had to do something mentally to keep yourself going. The people that just gave up, a lot of times the POWs I've talked to said you could kind of see it in the guy's eyes that he's not going to be here much longer. Those that were resilient and found things to do, they tended to live a little bit longer. Some of them were even kind of cocky and arrogant, like McDowell. He's a Marine. He would curse the Japanese, the guards, or they'd hit him. He'd tell them, that didn't hurt, and that didn't hurt me a bit, and they'd knock him down again, and he'd get back up, and his buddies are like, Mac, you're going to get yourself killed. But he didn't care. I mean, that was his way of just getting out frustrations or getting out anger. Doc Mango, very well respected by the guys there. He was an Army doctor, had a good practice. He left to go, serve in the war or get into the military right before the war. He helped save a lot of lives there at Palawan. 2 appendectomies that were done, one of them being McDowell over there. And the Japanese won't let him use any anesthesia or anything modern. So they just have to hold him down, arms and legs, and cut him open and work to take everything out and then sew him back up. It became badly infected, high fevers. McDowell, lay there for a week or more, pretty much near death. Had to open him up again and clean it out. And they eventually sewed him up, and Doc Mango used some of the buttons from one of the old military uniforms and sewed buttons into his gut down there. And the guards thought that was the craziest thing, and they would come in and his buddy would make him give cigarettes to him before he would show the buttons on his chest down there on his gut. But tough guys, tough way of living to endure what they did in those camps. You would steal food. They'd climb up trees or steal food from the jungle. If you got caught, you were severely beaten. But in some cases, they'd make little pouches or bags in their shorts where they'd try to bring in food and smuggle it in, or slip out at night and try to shimmy up trees. One guy fell and was severely hurt falling from a tree doing that, but you did what you had to. If they could catch rats or lizards or snakes, anything that moved, they would eat that because you needed the protein, you needed to survive. Those that couldn't take it anymore, they were too sick or just mentally could not take any more of this jungle work, making this airfield, they would injure themselves to get out of there. and they would break arms. George Burlage had a lot of chance to talk with his daughter and go through a lot of his papers. They called him the arm breaker. And it took me a while in the research to figure out that it was her dad that was the arm breaker, and she admitted later that she knew that. He'd told her that. But he would hold them down and put their arm on a rock or something and take a steel bar and beat their arm until he broke the arm. Most of the time, the Japanese would put them on the next hell ship back, ship them back to Manila and get some more good men. Some cases, if they didn't like you, they didn't care. They'd send you back to work. So you got one lame arm and you're trying to work with one arm. And the guys did what they could for morale to tick off the Japanese, if you will. McDowell would shovel a lot of dirt, and when they're not looking, he'd kind of shovel it back into the hole and just basically waste his time during the day. When it came to making the runways with the cement, they would purposefully mess up the mixture of the cement versus the water and the sand to where it would come out runny and gummy and it wouldn't set right, and they'd have to bust it up and start all over again. So they did what they could for their own morale just to kind of tick off the Japanese. But when they did make them mad, there was a pretty good price to pay. This is a scene taken right after the war. It's kind of torn up looking. But these coconut trees, what they kind of called the torture trees there in the camp. In November of '42, some of the guys were caught stealing. Again, you'd steal anything you could to survive. They were taking canned meat, canned goods from the Japanese storehouse. A couple of them were caught, and the Japanese lined up the rest of the company that was in question, and they had to stand there all day until finally 6 of them gave in and said, "Okay, we did it. They're gonna make us stand here forever until we give in." So they take these guys out one at a time and lash them to the trees, and the kempi tie is part of the treatment here, but they're whipped first with wire whips on their bare backs while they're tied to the trees until they're just hamburger meat. And then they decide the guys are looking away. One of the guys is looking away at his buddy getting beaten. So they go to taking bats and clubs and beating them until they're unconscious, making them watch the torture. One of the Marines decides he's a big, tough guy. He made homemade barbells and he'd lift coral and rocks and try to keep his muscles up. So the Japanese, mainly being smaller in stature, had a field day with him, seeing how long this Marine could take it. He earned the respect of all of his campmates, but he was a mess. When they finally hauled him back to the barracks that night, they got him to the door, and then the main guard slugged him in the face until they passed out unconscious. Some guys, it took 1 or 2 hits, and the one Marine I'm talking about, Taylor, he took a lot of hits before he went down, just kind of like McDowell. In spite of him, I'm going to just endure as much as I can. They shipped those guys back to Manila a few weeks later. 2 of them disappear off the books. Word is they were taken out and executed, but bodies have never been found. Here's one of the leaders of the kempi tie, the Japanese Special Military Police, Deguchi, the Master Sergeant, one of the most hated guys in camp. You did not want to tick these guys off because if you tried to escape or did something wrong, you're put in their little brig there near the camp. Now, this is after the war. It's 2 stories, but it's bombed out and it's in pretty poor condition. But you're left in these little cells, and they might starve you for days and interrogate you and torture you, and then take you out before the camp and torture you before the entire camp and make them watch. Those little bars there, that's where one of the Robolo guys slipped a note that made it into the hands of the yeoman in the camp and made it to the Guerrilla Network. That's how we ever knew in the first place that 4 American submariners were kept in this camp for a period of time because they were all either executed or died on a ship later on. This is the yeoman in question, Hubert Huff. Had the good fortune to get in touch with his daughter and get a copy of his little diary he kept, little Japanese journal book there. He was beaten pretty severely and was allowed to work in the commandant's office because they found out he was a yeoman, that he could type and transcribe, keep notes. He would keep rosters and rolls, but as he did this, he'd keep his own little secret notes that he kept stashed away. Like there's a page in the entry showing escape attempts. He would also document who came in what day, how many people were shipped out another day. And doing the research on this book was tough because there was not just volumes of stuff on it, other than the war crimes and the statements, but Huff's diary gave me exact dates of everything that came and went. And if he said 42 guys came in from Manila on this day, I'd eventually find a roster of exactly 42 guys that came in. So I have every reason to believe what he was doing there was pretty doggone accurate. Now here's the island divided up. I mentioned some of the guerrillas. They had a very detailed guerrilla network, not just on Palawan, but other islands. They had a commander in charge, and they had the whole area split into 4 different companies. You can kind of see the central area. The lower southern area is Company D. That's Captain Mayer. He'll come into play later, helping to save some of the survivors and be reunited with them later back in America. But that's the guerrilla network and some of their zones. Another one of the captains was Captain Mendoza. He really helped out with people. You know, if any aviators went down, they did what they could to try to work with them. But he was quickly branded a traitor by the Japanese and a spy and all this, and a bounty was put on his head. And January 44, the Japanese came to his house, took his wife and kids, and eventually let them go. But they took him off in the jungle, told her all kind of stories of where he was, or treating the wounded, or flown here, taken there. But they took him out and executed him. She didn't find that out until after the war. But her name was Trinidad Clark Mendoza. She went by the name Trini. But the POWs came to know her by the code name of Red Hanky. And that's because as they started making a little secret contact with the Filipinos, they would kind of whisper to them in the jungle, and they established some places to leave notes or little bits of food for the guys working in the jungle. Her case, her calling card was her hanky with the food or the notes in it tied with this red bandana. So they came to call her Red Hanky. And the POWs worked hard to maintain the secrecy where they had some contact points with the outside world, if you will. That's how they got their intelligence. Hubert Huff and Trini were reunited years later. There's a small memorial there on Palawan they helped put together. And she was instrumental in saving many lives, not just the POWs, but other airmen that were downed on the island and people on the run that I talk about in the book. Now, for a long time, the guys had no contact, and their families had no notification they were even alive. There were a couple of Red Cross efforts later brought into camp. They could write little 50-word notes back home. Elmo Deal here, he's kind of the humorous one. He's got, send me a carton of Duke's cigarettes and a pair of Levi's, like the Japanese are going to give that to him. But at least in some of those cases, the families learned that some of their sons are still alive. And so the airfield gets established. The Japanese bring in planes there after the Americans get this airfield built. This is a bombing raid taken in November of '44 and what it looked like. And what you don't see is during those raids, the Japanese would take cover and hide, go underground, go into shelters, and leave the POWs out there. A few of them got hit by shrapnel and wounded in different cases. One was killed by an aircraft that came in and landed and crashed, hit him. So they had not just torture to deal with, but even their own, friendly fire to worry about bombs being dropped with the Japanese forcing them to stay up there. But in camp, as the bombing raids became more frequent, they finally convinced the guards and the commandant that they needed some shelter because they needed the work. You don't want us killed. And they're allowed to dig trenches. Earlier slide, I showed you the campground there, and off to the side at the top of the bluffs. They dig these long trenches, 3 big ones, about 100 or more feet long, about 4 feet wide, or not tall enough to stand, but just kind of to hunch down. And they put palm trees and boards over the top and covered it over with dirt. So when there's an air raid, they'd clang the old church bell at the Catholic church, and that meant incoming planes take cover. So at least they had some kind of protection there. Now, these are some guys at the end of the war, what they look like after they've been able to shave and clean up. They're actually in better shape than some of the POWs would have looked earlier in the war. Long beards, ratty hair, terrible skin sores. But in '44, about September, they decided to split the camp in half. The airfields are complete. They need some maintenance, some more work done on the camp, but there's about 300 men left in camp. They take half of them, put them back on one of the hell ships, and ship them back to Manila. That's how Hubert Huff gets back, and George the arm breaker, and some of the other guys that are not there for the end. But 150 men are left in Palawan. Now the Allies begin making landings, of course, and even before that time, word is passed by high command that if Americans land on your island or they come in close to your camp, you need to slaughter them. Poison them, kill them, shoot them, stab them, do whatever you need to do, but make sure there's no evidence that we had a camp here And those orders were passed. Those were found after the war. And in the case of Palawan, there's a convoy sighted, and it appears it might be heading toward their island, and word gets out, and it's passed to the commander of the camp there. Landings might be imminent. Go ahead and take care of the prisoners, kill them. Execute all of them, leave no trace that they were there. This is Lieutenant Sato. They called him the Buzzard. All the guards had nicknames for mannerisms or their dress or their attitudes, but he was the Buzzard. He helped lead some of the execution squads that would kill the Americans there at Camp 10A. He would be the first to kill the first American there by driving a sword down through one of them's skulls because he was looking up out of the air raid shelter. This is a sketch. One of the survivors did a sketch, and I had an artist kind of enhance that. So take a second and kind of look at that and get an idea of the layout of the barracks and where some of these tunnels are that we'll talk about. So the men are awakened at 2 a.m. on December 14th, really early, taken out to the airfield. Kind of strange, they're thinking. And they work for a while, but the guards don't yell at them, they don't hassle them, there's no problems whatsoever, and even the mean ones are kind of sitting down. And so pretty quick the guys realize something's wrong here. Till finally Lieutenant Sato climbs up on a box and says, "Americans, your working days are over." Okay, they don't know what that means, but they're herded back into the trucks, taken back into camp, and put out in the compound. They figure they're waiting on food. Instead, there's an air raid. Turns out to be one lone plane flying around. After a while, all clear is sounded. They clang the bell, all clear. They come back up. They start getting food. Short time later, sound the alarm, go back down in the shelters again. No planes this time, come back out. By the time the third air raid is sounded, about 2 p.m., some of them aren't believing it. They think it's just ridiculous. They're not even going to go down in those shelters. But they're jabbed with bayonets and slapped in the head with rifles and forced to get down in the shelters. You see the 3 larger trenches, which could hold up to 50 men. And one guy was so wounded he was left out on a stretcher above during the air raid. There's an officer's hole up there. There's some other ones that would hold 2, 3, 4, 5 men. But what the Japanese do is move first to shelter A that you see there. It's got about 50 Americans in there. And they start pouring aviation fuel into the opening there. And the men smell this and they don't know what's going on. And then they throw torches in, goes up in a ball of flames, and the men are just left to burn alive inside a tube or a tunnel, if you will. Those that come running out, about 8 of them or so, are shot down, bayoneted, stabbed, just brutally killed. The next group is the little officer shelter. Doc Mango that saved all the guys with the appendectomies. They dump the fuel in there, light these guys on fire, and Mango comes running out on fire trying to tell them to stop, stop this massacre, we're not going to do anything, we'll do anything you want. They shoot him, stab him, proceed to douse him with fuel, light him up, and kill him right there as others watch. So the guys in the other big tunnel, B and C, and the smaller ones are seeing this, and some of them decide to start fleeing and making a run for it. So shelter B is the next one they come to start pouring in fuel and start lighting these guys on fire. Ed Petrie and Pacheco from the New Mexico group I talked about earlier, they're a couple that escaped from this tunnel. Petrie was another one of those, everybody had their own way of messing with the Japanese or keeping up morale. He tried to help out his fellow men by stalling tactics. He was kind of a mechanic, so they had him as a driver for the rock truck. He had to go to the rock quarry about 8 times a day and bring back rock and gravel for the POWs to spread. Well, he'd delay it he had a little ignition switch he put on the floor, and he'd tap that with his foot, and it would kill the engine. He'd raise the hood and start cussing at the engine and working on it for 30, 40 minutes, and the poor Japanese guard didn't know what to do. And he'd finally go over there and flip the switch and start the engine right back up. But, that was his way of messing with them and helping his fellow men get a little bit of a break. So these guys make a run for it, and making a run for it, the compound is surrounded by barbed wire. There's no way to go this way. The only way is the ocean, which is at the bottom of a 60-foot bluff. They've got to jump through barbed wire to get through that. So there's machine guns and rifles being fired at them while they're running. Petrie takes a shot in the ankle. They both jump over the cliff, roll down to the beach down below, and then they're just running wildly. Where do we go? It's a tiny little beach. Where do we hide? Do we swim? Do we run? And the Japanese start shooting down at the guys that make it down to the beach. Pacheco is shot through the left arm and shot through the thigh. They eventually take cover in some rocks for a while. This is an idea of what it looked like. Up at the very top would have been the camp, about 60 foot or so. There's some little goat trails that zigzag back and forth for the local villagers if they wanted to get down there. But when you're being shot at and chased, you just run and jump and tumble, hitting rocks and trees all the way down. Then you've got a very rocky, boulder-strewn beach and rocky soil down below. And most of these guys are barefoot at the very best. They've got rags or tatters at this point that they're left to wear. That's another view. So again, those that make it to the beach, now it's a manhunt. Anybody that got out of the massacre up above and wasn't burned alive, we're going to track them down and make sure we kill every last one of them. So these guys are running around like scared rats trying to figure out what to do. One of them is Beau. He's a Marine corporal. He's in a little 3-man shelter. He and his buddies decided to make a run for it. One of them gets shot down and killed trying to get through the barbed wire. Another buddy gets shot but gets over the bluffs with him. Beau gets shot in the leg getting through the barbed wire, and he jumps over the cliff. Then he gets down to the beach. He's hiding in the rocks and finally decides, I'm going to run toward this old pier down there. He gets a long stretch down the beach, just kind of running and dodging, barefoot, running on jagged coral, bloody feet. And he runs right into 3 Japanese sailors setting up a Lewis gun, a little machine gun. He's got not enough time to run back this way and hide, so he just decides just to barrel into them and takes them down in the water and just starts fighting with them by hand, trying to hold them down and drown them. And he finally wrestles that gun away from one of them after the other 2 take off running, sets it up, fixes the actuator that was wrong, and just opens fire, cuts down those 3 guys and kills them. And a few more bursts and the drum just falls off the gun and it becomes useless. So he's forced to ditch the gun and go hide. He crawls into a cavern and hides and stays there for the rest of the afternoon. The other Minnesota guy, John Lyons, I mentioned, he was another one, made it from the top, made it down to the beach. He also escapes the guys and gets into one of these cavern areas to hide. As the tide comes up later in the day, they get to a point where the water's up to their neck. They've got crabs pinching them, all kind of stuff going on. The final shelter, Shelter C, if there's the last big one, right along the edge of the bluff. And this is where the biggest group of Americans escape from. Some go out the back entrance and run through the barbed wire as the fuel's being dumped in there and lit on fire. But there's a little spot, maybe hard to see, but there's a little tunnel. As they were digging this, the Americans had to dig their own tunnels. They pulled a big coral boulder aside and dug a side trench that went to the edge of the bluffs. And they stopped just short of breaking free. And they shoved the boulder back in and put debris over it so if the Japanese looked in the hole, they wouldn't see it, thinking if we ever need this, we'll have an escape hatch. Well, as the fuel's coming and they see the other guys getting lit up, they furiously digging by hand, fingernails, and they bust through that last 6 inches of soil and start jumping through that opening. One of the last 2 out of there, Mac McDowell, we saw earlier, and a guy named Willy Smith from East Texas. Mac has fuel land on him. His shorts catch on fire. He has to rip those off. His rear end is burned red. But he and Smith get out the hole, and right before he does, he sees an old guy they call Pop Daniels. Old guy, he's 40 years old, but the stress of being a POW, his hair had turned gray, and big barrel-chested, stocky guy. A lot of these, 19, 24-year-old kids, he's old enough to be their dad, so they called him Pop. But he just froze up. He couldn't move, can't do it. Well, McDowell just grabbed him and shoved him and kicked him in the rear, literally kicked him through the hole and over the side. And so these guys get down to the beach, where there's roughly 30 or so Americans that made it down to the beach, wounded or in some shape still alive. Here's a couple of them, McDowell on the right again, and Gene Nielsen from Utah. They get down to the beach, and there's an old garbage dump. And everybody's getting in rocks, trying to figure out where to hide. The Japanese have gunboats going along the coast, and they're machine gunning anybody they can find. If you try to swim, the riflemen are picking you off, shooting you in the head as you swim. So they crawl up into the garbage dump and bury themselves under debris and waste and coconut husks and all kind of things. The things they see during the day are just horrific, because the Japanese at this point, they've killed everybody up above in the camp. Those they find, they're not going to kill outright. They're going to torture them just for blood sport, just for fun. and they watch a couple of guys caught. They're just bayoneted in the chest or the legs or the thighs and all over the body. Nothing lethal. 20, 30, 40 times getting jabbed, so you watch yourself bleed and beg for mercy out of agony. One of the guys they catch, McDowell and them are watching. They take him and pour some fuel on his leg, light his leg on fire. And the guy's running around screaming in agony. They hold him down, pour fuel on the other leg, light that leg on fire. And he's begging, you blank, blank, blanks, just shoot me, kill me right here, cussing at him. They don't. They light his arm on fire. They light his other arm on fire by pouring fuel on him. And the poor guy's just suffering and screaming for mercy until they finally douse him completely with fuel and light him on fire. And then drag him over to a palm tree and use him for bayonet practice. So if you're in that dump or anywhere seeing this, you're not about to surrender. If you surrender, you're going to die in the worst way possible. So they're left lying there while the Japanese are coming around, jabbing the ground with bayonets, looking for people. They miss McDowell. I mean, they literally step and walk right over him. He feels boots walking on the debris above him. Nielsen is laying there. They're both completely naked by this point, and when they pull back all the debris, he's just playing possum, playing dead. And luckily, at that very moment, some of the guards start shouting, time to come up, take a break. We're doing, dinner chow up at the top of the hill. Miracle of all miracles. Whatever, this guy's dead. They walk back up the hill and leave. And of course, as soon as they leave, Nielsen jumps up and takes off and makes his way down to the rocks. At least 9 different Americans took to the water that were not immediately shot when they got into the water. Kind of a crude map, but that gives you an idea of the point where the camp was. This Puerto Princesa Bay is a massive body of water. Depending on which way you swim, it could be 3 to 5 miles to get across. But it's the only chance these guys figure to get out of there because they know on the far shore there's the Iwahig penal colony. Prisoners, people that were, Filipinos that were held for various reasons, forced to work on this farm. Well, the Japanese didn't treat them well either. So they figure if we can get to the penal colony, some of these prisoners are probably our best bet to help us out. So you can see the route of some of them. One guy doesn't make it. He was either killed or drowned. Nielsen, the guy we saw in the last slide, he makes a swim for it right about dusk, and he's hit several times by bullets. The Japanese see him and open fire with the rifles. One skips off his forehead and puts a crease through his head. The worst one goes up under the arm. Another one hits him in the leg. And he's knocked pretty much unconscious at one point. And luckily kind of falls on his backside and regains consciousness before he drowns and continues his swim. And again, their journey is just beginning, just getting away from the camp. This is kind of what the bay looked like if you saw it from up above, looking across there. One point's closer, going toward the colony, you got to swim more of an angled route, which takes further distance, but less likely to find Japanese. This is kind of from the top of the bluff above Shelter C. So a bunch of these guys take to the water around darkness. Some of them did not, though. Willie Balchus and Elmo Deal went by the nickname Mo. Deal had been shot up making his escape, getting out of the massacre up above. He's got a shoulder wound, so he decides, I can't swim. I'm going to drown if I try to swim. So his buddy Willie, they decide, let's stay here. We'll go through the jungle. Let's see if we can't jump a Japanese guard here in the darkness and get one of their rifles, and we'll just make a run through the jungle. So they kind of set up their plan near a boulder up on the bluffs near the edge of the top of the camp there. But when they get the Japanese attention, the Japanese start coming down. Instead of 1 or 2 guards, they end up with 5 coming down. As they come around, they pass by with the torch, and then one of them finally spots them. The guys jump out. They've got big coral rocks in their hand, and they each manage to bash one of the Japanese in the head and kill him with the coral rocks. But by that point, Willie grabs the rifle from one of the fallen guys and takes off downhill for the beach. Deal's wounded. He doesn't get far. The other Japanese survivors get him, shoot him once in the process to subdue him, and they've got him up on the high side of the bluff, and they decide to put him through the same torture as the rest of them. Start bayoneting him, sticking him in the arms, the legs, and the thighs. He tries to fend off one blow, and he takes a severe bayonet through the forearm that left him with permanent nerve damage in that arm. But his saving grace was that Willie Balchus got down there on the beach and started firing back up toward the guards with that rifle. Only had 3 bullets in it. But it was enough to get their attention. Somebody's down there, this guy's shooting at us. So they just take one more bayonet thrust and shove Modil off the cliff. You know, he's been bayoneted numerous times, shot twice. He already had burns on him. He's dead. He tumbles down to the bottom of the bluff into the brush. And they go after Balchus. He swims out to an old seaplane and hides under a wrecked seaplane that's kind of half sunk out there, waits until the guards and the gunboats pass by, and he eventually starts his swim across the bay. And Deal there, Red Hanky, we talked about earlier, she would come into play later in helping to save him. Willy Smith, he had the nickname Willie because he hated Rufus, his given name, but he's an East Texas boy. He got out with McDowell at that shelter sea and ran around the beach and finally scuttled back up into the cliff sides there and found some brush and got up under that and hid where it was so dark you couldn't see him. Guards are coming through and bayoneting and jabbing, but he's in a good enough spot they can't find him. You know, at one point he has one of those giant island lizards come by and almost bite him, and he has to shoo that off, and it spooks a few of the guards as it goes racing downhill. Luckily, they didn't think to check and see what's up in the brush that scared that big lizard, that iguana. Long story short, though, Willie takes to the water that night and swims across, loses his shorts in the process. So like most of the others, you're completely naked. You've been running on rough coral, and you've either got bullet wounds or bayonet wounds or burns. His luck's even worse. He gets attacked by a shark partway across the bay, grabs him by the right forearm and starts trying to pull him under, and he fights back and beats on it until he gets it to let go of him. And he had a group of porpoise that ended up swimming along near him that he thinks helped scare off that shark or any other that might have came back after him. But he makes it across over to the jungles on the other side, spends a lot of time wandering through the swamps and through the briars and things tearing at your body, nothing to eat or drink until one of the Filipinos finds him. Joe Barda, each one of them has a unique story of how they escaped. Barda also swam. Once he got across, he was by himself, wandered for a good period of time, and the Japanese patrols found him, and he endured several chases through the jungle. Again, no clothes, running through the jungle wild, getting ripped and torn. Ended up climbing a tree later to try to see where the Japanese might have been or how to get out of the jungle after he'd shook them. One of the branches breaks, he falls, and in the most unopportune place, he gets ripped open by the stub of that tree branch, left laying on the ground, bleeding out pretty bad. He's forced to pick himself back up the next day and keep going. Days in the jungle, eating berries and drinking dirty water until December 23rd when he's found by some of the Filipinos. He's put in with a group with Beau and McDowell. There's a long story on McDowell, how he gets off where he was hiding in a cave. He ends up staying in the camp longer than anybody else, or at the beach below camp. But with our time, I won't go into that long story. But these three end up together, Beau, McDowell, and Barda. These are some of the guys that helped. I mentioned the network that was in place there. In addition to the network, you've got this guy, Pedro Paille. He's the leader of the colony over there on the other side. He comes in, and some of the POWs are beaten or abused when he talks to the guards, and they come to think he's a traitor. He's a turncoat. He's working with the Japanese. But he's really in the camp each time getting information, looking at the number of men, finding out what he can. But he's got to play it cool, and he does to the end. And so when the time comes, he's sending out his guys in their canoes and everything, looking for these survivors. Some they find in the bay hanging onto fishing traps, in the midst of their swim. And one of his lieutenants there helped serve as a guide to get them across the island. They've got to get far enough away from that POW camp to some of the farther points down south where they know there's a good chance that the coast watchers and the other guys can maybe help summon a PBY or a submarine to get them out of there. So there's a long story about just some of the journeys through the jungle and what these guys had to endure. There's another one, Jose Miranda. He got Petrie and Pacheco, the first two to swim across, and helped them hide in this little hut. 4 other guys are reunited with them in the jungle, and then they begin their trek through the jungle. And even the trek's pretty arduous. You barefoot still. Nielsen talks about how bloody his feet were and trying to not leave bloody footprints the Japanese could follow, but you had to try to step on the softest rock you could because your feet are all lacerated to begin with. They finally put 2 of them on some big water buffaloes, because they can't walk anymore. They're wounded. Koblos there takes a fall, badly breaks an arm that the had already had injured before. They have to set him in the jungle there with a splint. So just goes on and on, just the ordeal of just trying to get through the island and escape the Japanese looking for them. But by January 6th of 45, 3 weeks after the massacre, the first 6 guys are brought out, and they were helped by some Filipinos. Captain Mayor, I showed you earlier, his family, his kids, and all that helped. 2 of the kids are still alive today, live in the States. I got to talk with them a good bit about seeing these shark-bitten and bullet-wounded POWs coming into their camp and helping feed and water them and clean their wounds. Here's some of them after they've been taken over to an army camp, cleaned up. Koblos over there has got a hospital gown because he's got a cast on his arm. And I think the photos were kind of staged to hide some of the torture and abuse, because you think these guys don't look that bad, but one of them's got a bullet wound in the leg, and a couple others have various bullet wounds that are covered. Smitty on the far right, you see his left side, well, his right arm's the one that's been torn up by the shark, so it's all kind of disguised well by the military photographer. They did a little short film there too, had a intelligence officer interview these first 6 guys, and some of this film footage is in the National Archives, and you can even Google and see a couple of minute clips online that people have posted. But what they learned, MacArthur and the Allies learned, is the Japanese are going to wipe out some of these camps when we invade and kill every American in there. So he moves quickly and sends people out to start making raids. And you've heard some of the famous stories, Cabanatuan, Santa Tomas, Bilibid Prison. These guys getting rescued led to immediate raids that saved more than 3,600 POWs, civilian and military POWs. So a lot to be said for that, and that's kind of the other side of the story that I think's really what they helped with, is not only having the perseverance to get out of there, but to help save many other lives. The next 3, Beau, McDowell, and Barda, they're flown out by PBY, but it's January 21st, so it's several weeks later after that before they're taken to a safe point and get picked up by PBY. They, of course, tell their stories, and then these 9 guys are making their way back to America. And you see some accounts that talk about the 9 survivors of Palawan, but there were actually 11. El Modil got bayoneted and shot and burned and thrown off that cliff. He comes to before dawn and crawls through the rain, through the jungle. Again, long story short, but he makes it to friendly hands. Red Hanky, Miss Mendoza, helps him out, has some of her murdered husband's clothing she can give to him to put on him, help treat his wounds, and get him into the Guerrilla Network and get him moving. But he's not flown out till February 20th, 2 months after the massacre. The last guy, old Pop Daniels, that had to get help getting shoved out of that shelter, he's shot in the legs and wounded by the Japanese. He makes it to friendly hands, but he's 47 days running with the guerrillas before he's eventually found as the Allies make landings in late February on Palawan. So just to kind of sum things up and leave some time for questions, Americans land there in short order, find out about the massacre. This is one of the soldiers excavating one of the holes. This is actually Shelter C, where McDowell and some of those guys were, and Pop Daniels. And you can kind of see the edge of the cliff there, and to the left would have been that escape hatch, that secret hole they dug that went out toward the water. Only about 18 Japanese could be found to be brought to war crime trials later. A good number of them were supposedly killed on the island as the Marines and Army came ashore and did the fighting to liberate Palawan. Of those, there were some sentences of various years in prison, but by about 52, we commuted all the sentences and opened the prison doors and let all the Japanese prisoners go that we'd ever convicted. A few higher ups, say with the Bataan Death March and things like that, were either shot or hanged, but the majority got some kind of prison sentence and were later let go. So not a lot of justice for the guys that survived that. A couple more views here of the excavation of some of the bones you can see after they've taken the roofs off the shelters, and skeletons and skulls and just horrific things. They were able to find about 123 men, the remains, out of the 139 that died. 11 escaped, 139 were killed. Those 123 were eventually taken in 1952 to the Jefferson Barracks National Cemetery near St. Louis and reinterred there. Some of the men that had been Palawan POWs were there that day to honor them and do speeches, including Gene Nielsen and Mac McDowell. And that's where those guys are laid to rest. 11 or so of them, they just never found the remains because they were either burned up or in some cases probably shot in the ocean and bodies not recovered out of the water. So a few of them gave testimonies later, some oral histories. McDowell later was reunited with Captain Mayor and his family, and Marianne, the daughter, who lived in Wisconsin. They connected and ended up on Good Morning America, where he got to tell his story about being one of these 11 survivors. So some of the Filipinos got due credit and got recognized for that, but this was a story I was just really enthused about telling because I don't think as many people are aware of it. There's a few other POW escape stories that are pretty famous, but once I learned the details of just escaping the gunfire and the gasoline, what they had to go through for weeks, I was pretty entertained by that. You think I need to keep digging this up and keep researching it?
We're going to move to another. I actually found a guy that had visited Palawan. Do I say that right or wrong? Palawan. Ron, could you come up? Ron Kelly, many of you know him through the air shows we have at Eden Prairie. And why don't you stand over here in front of the podium, Ron? Ron approached me about 3 weeks ago and said, hey, I had reason to go to the Philippines. Ron, give a brief explanation of that.
Well, Don, I brought some pictures that I had. The reason I was in Palawan is that I was in Korea and then got out of the service after the war, went to school, and met my wife there. She was a Filipino. 4 children, 11 grandchildren, and each time we would go back to the Philippines for an event. And this particular time, her uncle turned 95, so the family gathered there. And then when the family business was over, Nancy and I would travel. We traveled as much in the Philippines as we could, and it's become quite a resort area now. And I knew about the story and about the camp and about how the thing went. So I wanted to go to the memorial and say a prayer, basically. And I took some pictures, which I gave to Don. I think he's going to show them. And that's about the story.
Your wife was the cousin of the president of the Philippines?
Yes, the two of them grew up together. Her mother and the president's mother were sisters. Yeah.
And so Ron had...
He was a West Pointer too, by the way, but it was after the Second World War. And
But Ron had a great opportunity to travel to many places in the Philippines. But the next couple of slides are what Ron shared with us. And I thank you so much for coming forward with that, Ron. This is the memorial of the events of Palawan. And here's the marker of the memorial of the 143 prisoners of war. And you see the survivors. Here, use the... And then this is the U.S. Army that were killed. And here's a list of the Marine and Navy. And again, you realize from Steve's presentation, these were the ones that could be documented. The thing that happens with so much of the, and I can't right offhand tell you, but I think there's like 60,000 MIAs left. Many of them are washed overboard. They continue to find them. I'm talking about World War II. MIAs. Steve, can you talk about the war crimes? Were those held in Tokyo?
Yeah, they were, for the most part, held in Tokyo, and it started with rounding up the men that could be found and identifying them one by one. A lot of the Palawan survivors went on to go back and get out of the military and start families, but Doug Beau stayed in, and he happened to be stationed overseas at the time, so he was called in to help find war criminals to prosecute and identify them. Mac McDowell was called back over there to help out with that. And one of the guards they found was one of the brutal ones, and he, of course, they would deny everything. We didn't do this, we didn't do that, none of that, it's all lies. And the guards were taking him back to his cell afterwards, and Beau caught that guy in the hall and pretty much knocked him unconscious. And long story short, that they helped identify the ones to bring to trial there in the Tokyo area. They didn't necessarily get the justice they hoped with light sentences or no sentences.
Well, of course, the book and the movie Unbroken is a similar type. But how many camp situations like that, and I know I'm putting you on the spot here, like the Los Baños, like the Cabanatuan, like Palawan. There's another one that I'm aware of, but I mean, were there 20, 30, yeah, 120?
Total camps?
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of the numbers. I think about 28% of Allied POWs died in captivity, including Canadian and Australian, New Zealand, and a couple others. I read that number. I've read other figures. But I want to say there was more than 100 camps scattered between all the different islands. Some of them were very small. Some of them, like Cabanatuan, were large with thousands of men. But then they were moved up into the mountains in Tokyo and lots of other cities to work in the coal mines, to work on the docks, to work in the steel mills. So lots of little small scattered camps in addition to the major camps that we think of. So I don't have an exact number though, but Roger Mansell did terrific POW research. You can go online and look up his POW site. It has lists almost by each camp, and you can click on the camp and see photos, see rosters, lots of great information.
Did the Japanese, were they as thorough in the documentation of names, rosters in their camps as the Germans were?
No, some of this is put together by the Americans themselves. Doing the other POW book I did, it's surprising. You can't keep anything at all there, and yet the number of guys that managed to keep small diaries or make recipe books, because all they did was think of food. And so many of them I've seen had complete recipe books they'd handwrite, but they would write down names, addresses, contact points for every POW they can get their hands on. Yet some camps they did have better roster systems, but others I've seen, it's more by like Yeoman Huff or somebody else that kept the records that we have it.
But the Red Cross didn't have the access to the Japanese as they did to the Germans?
They were given some access in various camps, but a lot of times when they came in, it was just a routine inspection, walkthrough, nothing noted. The most abused people, they're visible to you. Nothing's done about it. And the goods they would leave, in some cases, the Japanese would hoard for months on end and never give to the POWs. Or when they did, they would take out the best meats or foods and give them the stuff they didn't care about. But if you got anything as far as a Red Cross package, you were pretty darn happy about that. But I'm sure the Red Cross had some lists they kept, but I'm sure they're not complete in most cases.
Well, oh, there's a question. Yeah, here. Let me come up with a mic. Pardon me.
Yeah, in the book King Rat, one of the prisoners worked the system and had a pretty good life. Was that based on any actual occurrence?
Working the system?
Yeah.
There were people like that. There was one guy they nicknamed Boots because he wore a pair of boots, like cowboy-type boots. He was more of a turncoat. He would rat out Americans to the Japanese and get favors or get food and stuff like that. And he had a note kind of a traitorous type note, and McDowell and Smitty found out about that and worked the guy over and got the note. He was eventually shipped back to Manila, but I've read other cases in other camps where, one or two guys would make out pretty well. Of course, the Americans, if they could get their hands on the guy, they would kill him if they had their chance, but most of them preferred to starve or die than to help the Japanese in any way whatsoever.
Whatever happened to the red hanky lady, Minnie Mendoza? Her life, where did that lead?
Yeah, she remarried later an American serviceman, took on a different last name, but she and Hubert Huff maintained correspondence for years. That you saw as in one of those old photos, probably back in the 50s and 60s. They got together a couple times. She passed away a long time back. I did get in touch with some of the Filipino people, including two of the kids whose father was one of the captains, and had some contact with people in Puerto Princesa that helped look up things for me. But she's been passed away for quite some time. Mendoza, he had a son, he goes by the nickname Buddy Mendoza. He's still alive. He's a pretty elderly man now, but there's a World War II museum there that you may have seen that has memorabilia from different American soldiers and things. And Buddy maintains that, which also honors the Fighting 1,000, the Palaweños that were in the rebel force with the guerrillas. So he honors his father, who was murdered by the Japanese, and any Americans who helped liberate his people.
Yes, sir.
You mentioned prior to the massacre, the POWs were split, and some went somewhere and some stayed there. How did they determine who went where?
That's a pretty good question. I didn't get a clear answer, but they kept, in a lot of cases, the more able-bodied men there. And during the course of August 42 up until the massacre in December 44, if you had a broken arm or if you had such severe malaria that you couldn't work or you were just crippled, those are the people they would ship out. If they had escapees they caught and tortured half to death, they would eventually ship them back to Manila because they knew they were going to try to escape again if they got the chance. So a lot of those went back. Not all of them are in bad shape. So, and one of them, Smitty said it's hard to figure who got where, but it was kind of a A-B scenario. This group of names get over here, this group of names get over here, and we're going to march you back to the barracks. And then next thing you know, half of that 150 of the guys are marched down to the docks and kept on the ship for 3 or 4 days and then shipped out. And they come to realize later that they didn't need the labor anymore. But if the Japanese had a good reason for the ones they kept, I didn't find that.
Did any of the camp commanders survive the war to be brought to trial?
Not one that they could find. One or two of them, they were pretty sure were killed during the course of the war. Another one kind of went underground and disappeared. They think he probably went into hiding. Some were killed as the war moved forward on the island of Palawan. Some of the guys that were captured, at least one guy that was brought forward to be a war crimes prosecuted person, he testified, and that night on the way home, going back to his house to wait, the Army telling him what to do next, he went down to the train station and jumped in front of a moving train, committed suicide because he wasn't about to go sit in a prison cell. So there were probably a few that murdered, took their own lives in the form of suicide that I've heard about.
Yeah, that was my brother that was asking about how the split happened, who went where, because our father was one of the ones that went to Manila. And so it could have went either way. Either we wouldn't be here now, potentially, but he made the cut, and that's why he's asking that, because our father was there up until the time that the 159 or whatever left there. So.
What's your father's name?
Ralph Anderson.
Okay, yeah. He did some war crimes testimonies. I remember seeing his name speaking out about various bits of abuse that happened to various other prisoners. And that, by the way, your dad and people like that in 45 and 46, as they're preparing to prosecute the Japanese, they rounded up any American soldier they could that was there. Did you see this beating? Did you see this execution? In some cases, they gave very lengthy statements of what they saw, and one guy after another, so you could kind of piece together some of the story of Palawan from people like your dad. So hats off to him for what he had to endure.
Support for this program provided by viewers like you. Thank you. Additional support provided through the Catherine B. Anderson Fund of the St. Paul Foundation. Upcoming roundtable topics can be found at www.mn-ww2roundtable.org. Production services provided by Barrow's Productions.